Buongiorno, good morning, and welcome to the International Conference on Climate Change. Today we have a very distinguished set of guests, G20 policymakers, international organizations, representatives from the international financial community. Our aim is to advance global dialogue and make progress in developing a common understanding on how to better support the achievement of net zero targets. In the morning session, we will discuss the characteristics of the policy mix needed for guaranteeing a just transition of our economies and society towards the net zero. I leave immediately the floor to Minister Daniele Franco.
Thank you, Alessandro, and dear colleagues, dear friends, good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you all together with Governor Visco to this international conference on climate change. Those of you who have been with us over the last couple of days already know how high climate issues feature on the agenda of our G20 presidency. Friday, we heard interesting ideas at the symposium on tax policies and climate change. Yesterday, in the G20 meeting, we continued the discussion on global policies for a green recovery and on the role of the financial system in promoting a just transition. Climate change is a concrete threat to people, planet, and prosperity. I believe Venice is a perfect representation of the beauty of our planet, but also of its vulnerability to climate and nature. Since the very beginning of its history, Venice has had to carefully preserve the lagoon, even moving the flow of some rivers, 3 rivers actually, out of the lagoon to protect its fragile environment. Now the entire world has become vulnerable to our activities, and we need to protect our ecosystem before it is too late. A positive fact is that the debate on climate issue has become increasingly relevant in the international policy agenda. Such a recognition has pushed many governments to announce net zero goals to be achieved by mid-century. Nevertheless, to actually reach net zero targets, we need immediate concrete actions. Postponing the adjustment needed will only make them more challenging, perhaps too challenging and sudden. This would in turn generate shocks and financial stability risks. The current political and economic juncture give us an opportunity in this sense. We can steer the recovery and take the bold measure needed to support a just transition. The green transition should not be seen as an obstacle, but rather as an asset for our recovery strategies. By supporting quality investment in sustainable infrastructure and innovative clean technologies, we can boost productivity, foster a resilient growth, and promote a shared prosperity. The transition to carbon neutrality will not be an easy journey. We all know that. Reorienting our economies entails costs in the short run. To prevent a disorderly transition, we need a comprehensive strategy. We should also build our choices on solid analytical frameworks, identify the most efficient and appropriate tools for reducing emissions. At the same time, we need to ensure a just transition, a transition where no one is left behind. Tackling climate change is a global challenge which calls for coordinated policy action. It is also a challenge that requires the mobilization of considerable resources. The international financial community and private sector should actively participate to support the achievement of the Paris Agreement objectives. Finally, differences across countries in terms of fiscal pace and access to financial markets should be taken into account. In conclusion, we need a comprehensive strategy. This is why we convened today the most relevant global actors to discuss and coordinate their respective actions to support the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals. We have structured the conference in two main sessions. In the morning session, we will discuss the policies to address climate change and to support the transition in emerging markets and developing economies. Then, in the afternoon, we will focus on the initiative to mitigate climate-related financial risks, to gather valuable data to assess risks, and the carbon footprint of projects and investment, as well as to seek the engagement of the private financial sector. I look forward to hearing the views of our distinguished speakers on these crucial topics. So, without further ado, I will leave the stage to Ignacio to introduce the keynote speaker, Professor William Nordhaus, whom I thank for having accepted our invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Daniele. Welcome to you all. It is a great honor for me to have Bill Nordhaus opening this Venice International Conference on Climate Change. Obviously, Professor Nordhaus needs no introduction, especially to the people who are here today, and there is certainly not enough time to list all his many academic achievements. But please indulge me in sharing with you a couple of personal memories about his work. In the early 1970s, I was studying for my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and I came to know an influential NBR paper that Bill Nordhaus wrote with Jim Tobin on whether GNP, at the time we used this gross national product, now we talk about GDP, and considering whether that was an obsolete measure of economic progress. Only a few years had passed since Bob Kennedy had famously asserted that GDP measures almost everything except those which make life worthwhile. But Nordhaus and Tobin really accurately examined several corrections, taking into account non-market activities, the environmental pollution and others, and other leisure other items that are not normally measured and accounted for in GNP or GDP. And they concluded at the end that GNP, albeit imperfect, still provided a relevant picture of the way the economy performs and of economic growth. And the conclusion that most, I think, economists today would subscribe, certainly policymakers. Now, during the same years, Professor Nordhaus recognized early on the weaknesses of a report that was commissioned by the Club of Rome. I remember that because I was distributing this report in Rome just after my graduation in 71, 72. And it was interesting because the limits to growth, that was the report, pointed out the flaws of gloomy scenarios. Pointed out that there were risks that, unless it was corrected, a gloomy scenario would have taken place. A scenario which predicted an imminent depletion of natural resources. Nordhaus observed rather correctly that this depletion was largely based on the extrapolation of the trends. They were engineers. They were basically putting together trends and trying to understand whether limits would have been reached under this extrapolation. But they did not take sufficiently in consideration the role of markets, the rebalancing power of prices, the servo mechanisms, and the nature of technological change that takes place endogenously, often as a response to market failures. And in particular, when the resources used in production became scarcer, an increase in prices discourages demand. Higher prices subsequently provide an incentive to develop new production methods that utilize less of these resources. A few years later, Professor Nordhaus, however, understood, perhaps much earlier than others, that indeed there are limits to economic growth. But these limits arise not much, perhaps not only from depletion of natural resources, but mostly from the limited capacity of the atmosphere to absorb the greenhouse gases generated by human activities. And in 1992, we provided all of us with an important quantitative tool, which was called the DICE, the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, that compared benefits of action against climate change with the costs of inaction. In his recent Nobel Prize lecture, Professor Nordhaus convincingly argued that climate change is a particularly thorny externality due to its global nature. And this puts it outside the domain not only of markets, but also of national governments. It is really a global problem. And so we wonder today how the global community can overcome this environmental standoff. It is a challenge that calls for coordinated action across countries, and this is the main reason why we, this year, have put the fight against climate change at the center of our G20 presidency. To conclude, in the last few years, there have been proposals by Professor Nordhaus, some really thought-provoking response to the challenge of climate change, with the establishment of a climate club in which somehow those who do not belong to the club may have to pay and therefore there is an incentive to join the club to avoid trade penalties. It is obviously a proposal that has several technical, economic, geopolitical difficulties, but the issue really is without a mechanism like this or similar tools, there may be free riding in the reduction of carbon emissions. People, countries will wait for others to act, and if in waiting, nobody most likely acts. So the issue is what kind of pragmatic way forward do we have or we may design to arrest climate change. Professor Nordhaus will help us to keep this debate open, avoiding any hasty, I hope, dismissal of potentially useful policies. So I would close expressing my hope that the G20 will contribute to fostering a broad agreement on the necessary steps, and that the next COP26 in Glasgow will succeed in transforming good intentions, like the ones we have today, into concrete actions. And let us now hear from Professor Nordhaus himself. I'm very grateful for you having accepted to be here today with us. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful spot. Many of you who've been here have heard people remark on the beauty and the history of Venice, and I'd just like to give you my own view of it. Venice flies, if you're in Venice, you fly under three flags. The first flag is the flag of Venice. And Venice, among many things, is remarkable as having the longest lived democracy of any major polity in the world. The democracy in Venice, until it was interrupted by Napoleon, lived 500 years. And that's a worthy achievement. The second flag we fly under here when we're in Venice is the flag of Italy. And the flag of Italy is important for many things, but for what we're doing today, it's important because Italy was the home of the first universities. And although universities in the early days were perhaps not what they are today, universities have evolved into institutions of independent thinking, of science, social, natural, as well as humanities. And the reason that we have the kinds of knowledge about scientific and economic affairs that we do today is because of the rise of these great universities. And the final flag in Venice is the flag of the EU. And the EU is also another important institution, as really the major multinational institution today with power over many nations. And all three of those are put together because those are an inspiration for the kinds of policies and thinking we need as we go forward to deal with climate change. What I'd like to do today is talk about four issues. The first one is what I'll call the state of the world in terms of climate change policy. And all I'll do is show you a little on that there's been basically no improvement in emissions over the last 3 decades. For all the talk and all the COPs and all the conferences of the parties, we've made very, very little progress in reducing the trend of emissions. I'll show you that first. Then you ask, why is that? And there are really 3 reasons. One is that a key ingredient in reducing emissions is high carbon prices, high prices on CO2 emissions. While it's true that in the EU you have a relatively high emissions prices on CO2 emissions, it only covers part of the economy, and it only covers a very small part of the world. So globally, prices are still very low. Secondly, we suffer from inadequate investment in low-carbon technologies because of the externalities there. So there's a kind of another externality in addition to the climate externality, which is the knowledge externality. And finally, Ignacio mentioned at the end, our chair, the problem of free riding, and that countries are free riding on the actions of others, and because of the free riding, that has undermined our climate agreements. So those are the 3 points that I'd like to, one is an overview point about where we stand, and the other 3 is about the policies that are necessary and ones on which we're falling short. This is the first figure I'll show you, and this basically shows what's happened with respect to decarbonization since 1990 through 2019. I go through 2019 because that's the last year when we have data that looks reliable. After that, the pandemic has mucked up all the data. And so what this shows is what's the carbon intensity of global production. That's to say CO2 emissions, industrial CO2 emissions, divided by global real GDP. And you can see there's a straight line there, which is the red line, which is declining at 1.8% per year. And then you have the dotted blue line, which shows the actual numbers, the actual intensity. This excludes China because China is so big and has had such different trends that it tends to distort the aggregate data. And what you can see from this is there's been basically no break in the trend over the last 30 years. So even with the agreements of Kyoto, while going back to the Framework Convention in the early 1990s, the Kyoto Treaty in 1997, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Accord, you can see virtually no change in the trend of decarbonization. That trend line would have to turn very, very sharply down if we were going to meet our objectives. I'll show those in a second, but I would like to emphasize that this trend, accompanied with 3 or 4% GDP growth, means that CO2 emissions are rising. But this is the key trend to look at if you want to know the effectiveness of policies. Now, this is the first and key item that I'd like to talk about. I'll talk about the reasons for this in a minute, but this is the key thing that you need to take into account when you look at how far our various conferences of the parties and the way we've gone up to date, how well they have worked. Now, the key point I'd like to next point is that policies are inadequate for our international objectives. And to do this, I'll show you, I need to go back. I'll show you the emissions going back to 2015 and the latest through 2019, and then the projections according to climate modelers of emissions, CO2 emissions going forward. So emissions in 2019 were around 53 or 54 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This includes non-CO2 gases as well. And with current policies, that's to say virtually no policies, as I'll talk about later, that will grow slowly 1 or 2% per year over the coming decades. Will not turn down, but will continue to grow according to current projections. Current policy that has been agreed upon in the Paris Accord has national policies. These are voluntary policies, but they're policies that countries, virtually all countries, have agreed to. And in the middle line there, in the blue line, it shows through 2030 what countries have actually agreed to. And then after 2030, assuming the same degree of tightening. But we don't need to go beyond 2030 to get the major point, which is that even with the Paris Accord, and this is assuming countries meet their obligations under the Paris Accord, there will be basically emissions will basically be flat over the next 20 years. There will be very, very little improvement in emissions if countries meet their obligations under the Paris Accord. The final line at the bottom there shows you a run that estimates what emissions would need to be if we were to meet the international target of 2 degrees C. And that would have this is one that meets it efficiently. It's not the only one, but it's one that meets it in a way that's cost effective at minimum cost. And that would involve a sharp decline in emissions. And if you look, you can see around 2050, it gets to 0 net emissions of CO2 equivalent. This is global emissions, including non-CO2 greenhouse gases. But the main point is that that would involve a very sharp and steep drop in emissions and emissions intensity to reach the 2-degree target. As you can see, even if countries meet the Paris Accord, they will be only a fraction of the way to meeting the international objectives, and there are also questions about whether those will be met. So there are 3 policy issues that need to be discussed. There are 3 ingredients to meeting our objectives. One is carbon pricing, the other is technology, and the third is international agreements. So let's start with carbon prices. It's been well known for many years that high prices on CO2 emissions is a key and really a necessary ingredient in carbon policy. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. And it's a key to sharp emissions reductions. A second point, which is not quite so obvious, is that the level of price, of the carbon price, of the emissions price, needs to be harmonized to meet the objectives. By harmonization, I mean harmonized across countries. We could say equalized if you like, but harmonized is a less ambitious goal. And also needs to be harmonized across sectors. So you can't have some sectors, say motor fuels, with very, very high carbon prices, and other sectors, such as electricity generation, with very low carbon prices. So a key ingredient is that the level of price should be harmonized across countries and should be high. But the fact, as I'll show you in a minute, is that prices, carbon prices, emission prices, and the regimes under which they operate, the structures under which they operate, are highly fragmented. If you were to reach the target of 2 degrees C, that would require a uniform or at least average price, effective price, somewhere between $50 and $150 per ton of CO2. But if you look at the calculations of the actual carbon price that have been prepared by the World Bank, the average carbon price in 2019 was about $2 per ton of CO2. So 2 instead of 50 to 100. So that shows one reason why policies have been so ineffective is because carbon prices are so low. I show you next a picture of what I call the carbon price landscape from the World Bank. This is from the World Bank report, and it's a kind of collage. It's a collage of policies of different countries. And what it shows on the horizontal axis, there are two things it shows. On the horizontal axis, it shows the share of emissions that are covered by a regime. And on the vertical axis, it shows the carbon price of the regime. So you look, there's the large green bubble in the middle, the lower middle. That's the European Trading Scheme, which is the largest trade and also multinational trading scheme. And it covers, there are two things about it that you note. It's very large, or a third, I guess. But one is that the price is relatively low. It's been as low as $5 and as high as $50 a ton. But in this period, it was a little under $20 a ton. But more important is it only covers a fraction of the economy, less than half of the European economy. So you can see other, if you can see that, you can see other countries around the world. You can see on the right, there are countries with there are regions. The right dot there has a very high coverage rate and a very low tax. That's the Quebec cap and trade and the California cap and trade. And then off the map, it isn't really shown. You have Sweden and Switzerland with very high prices but very low coverage. Just to be clear, if you were, I'm going to superimpose on this what you would need. That pink dot there shows you what you need to meet your objectives. You need 100% coverage, and you need a very high price. Right? You need all the countries to have 100% coverage or nearly 100% coverage, and you'd also need a very high price. And you can see in the background there what reality is, that none of the countries have high prices and 100% coverage. And again, this only shows the countries with coverage, and 80% of the emissions are actually at 0, countries like the United States and other countries. So the point here, I would just emphasize, is that carbon prices are a key to climate change policy, but they're fragmented and they're low. So a second policy area is one that's necessary, perhaps not emphasized so much because people have focused on carbon prices, but in a way just as important. To reach our objectives, we're going to have a major technological transformation in the energy sector. We're going to have to replace many of the technologies that we now use with new technologies. But just as there's a climate externality, there's also a technological externality, because the public returns on green innovation are much larger than the private returns on green innovation. There's a double externality here, because there's already a gap between the public and private returns to innovation, because the inventors only get a small fraction of the returns. But in addition to that, the fact that the returns are underpriced because carbon emissions are underpriced lead to a double externality. So this means there's inadequate research and development in green technologies. And you can use as examples carbon capture and sequestration, for which there's basically no economic incentive to undertake it now. Advanced nuclear, which is already extremely expensive and does not have any advantage over fossil fuels because of low carbon prices. And hydrogen usage in various sectors, and hydrogen technology, which is also currently very expensive, needs vast expenses of R&D and subsidies of R&D, but won't get it as long as there's no carbon pricing and no incentives. So the policies here are two. One is that you can already improve the incentives by carbon pricing. If you have high carbon prices, then already green technologies and low carbon technologies will have an advantage that they don't have now. So carbon pricing is not just an incentive in terms of trying to get people to reduce their use, but it's also just as important an incentive inducing innovation in low carbon technologies. And in addition to that, we need enhanced incentives at the level of our governments, our fiscal incentives and intellectual property incentives for low carbon technologies. I will just give you one example of misplaced priorities in our governmental research budgets, and that is the misplaced priority in the U.S. federal R&D, research and development. I might have asked you whether you thought we spend more on energy R&D or defense R&D. I've asked this before, and people usually don't know. But the fact is, as you can see here, there's a vast misplaced priority in terms of federal research and development. Weapons and nuclear weapons and security, and this was back in 2018 budget, had almost $60 billion of federal research and development, whereas advanced energy and renewables had only $2 billion. And that has not changed very much since 2018. The real priority is we need to get that right bar way up. We need to increase dramatically in all of our technologically advanced countries the investment in green technologies. And these are federal subsidies, federal research and development tax credits, and other elements. Final point I'd like to make is the problem of free riding and how free riding undermines international climate agreements. I think it's a painful realization, but I think we need to face that our international climate policy, the approach we're taking, is at a dead end. We've gone through all these 26 conferences of the parties, and we're still with voluntary agreements. And voluntary agreements are hampered by free riding. All of our climate agreements to date, back to the Framework Convention, through the Kyoto Protocol, through the Paris Accord, are voluntary. Countries agree to take steps, but there are no penalties if they don't take the steps. Under the Kyoto Protocol, when the US withdrew, there were no penalties. When Canada withdrew, there were no penalties. There are no penalties for non-participation, and there are no penalties for not meeting your goals. Now, you might say, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that countries under this free riding possibility will fail to reduce emissions or fail to keep commitments to reduce emissions in a costly fashion. And for those of you who have been involved in other areas, it's very similar to the race to the bottom in global corporate taxation, where we've seen the very sharp reduction in corporate taxes as companies race to the tax shelters. And it's a very similar kind of problem trying to face it, that there's a kind of free rider problem as long as there's no incentives and there's no penalties for countries not to reduce their corporate tax. So one proposal, which was mentioned earlier, is what I've called a climate club to overcome free riding. And what we see as we look at the history of international agreements, such as the World Trade Organization, is that effective agreements require incentives. They require carrots and sticks. They require countries to make promises, to make commitments, but they also require consequences if they don't keep their commitments. And this is the same thing that we need with a climate treaty, which we don't have with any of the current climate treaties or the current proposals. And here's just an example. You can think of others, but this is one that we have studied and modeled been modeled in different places, Yale and other universities. You might start with a target price, which is the obligation of countries is that they have a minimum domestic carbon price. They can meet whichever way they want, cap and trade or carbon tax, but they have to meet a minimum carbon price, rising over time. And then there's a penalty on non-participants and people who don't meet the obligations of something like a penalty tariff. And for these examples, I've used a uniform tariff, which is much simpler to administer than a countervailing duty. And the modeling we've done at Yale and at other universities suggests that this very approach of a minimum carbon price of, say, $50 a ton or $100 a ton, and I'll say a modest uniform penalty on non-participants of 3 to 5% would actually induce participation, widespread participation by different countries. So if I can summarize then, just to come back to the 4 points I started with, there's been very little progress on slowing warming. There's been lots of policies and lots of steps and lots of conferences, but if you look at the proof of the pudding, as they say, if you look at the actual key element, which is emissions intensity has declined at about the same rate over the last 10 years as it did the 10 years before that and the 10 years before that. We need to see a downturn in that decarbonization, and we have not seen it to date. A first central goal of policy needs to be high and harmonized carbon prices. And this would be high prices starting at least at $50 a ton, perhaps rising sharply after that, harmonized across countries and across sectors. One of the elements, third point, one of the elements that's been underemphasized is the importance of low carbon technologies and the fact that there's underinvestment in those, partly because of low carbon prices, partly because the governments have not put the kind of support into those sectors that are needed given its priority. And finally, effective international policies require some kind of club structure, some kind of structure where you have carrots and sticks along with carrots, I should say, where you have incentives for countries to participate. So countries participate because it's in their interest to participate, not because they're being lectured to participate or being cajoled or coerced to participate. So a club type of structure would be approach to that. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hello. So, thank once again Professor Nordhaus for his insightful keynote speech. I think the message to global policymakers is clear and leaves no doubt. Our announcements on carbon neutrality should be followed by concrete action. And I see the similarity to the issue of global corporate taxation. International financial institutions have been at the forefront on the global climate action. They play a crucial role in stimulating the policy debate, suggesting policies, coordinating efforts by NDBs and other international institutions. Today, they will contribute to frame and animate our discussion on climate change and on policies for a just transition and sustainable recovery. Over the past few months, the staff of the fund and of the bank have been working alongside Italian colleagues to underpin the conference with solid analysis and policy proposals. In particular, the IMF staff coordinated a group of experts which focused on global climate policies. As I said in my introduction earlier, the transformation of our economies and societies calls for the adoption of a comprehensive policy mix, including a package of public investment and policies for a just transition. Strategic green investments, specific market-based mechanisms, including carbon pricing instruments to incentivize low-carbon production and consumption, effective measures to mitigate the adverse impact of the transition on vulnerable groups should all be key pillars of this strategy. Kristalina will guide us through this topic. In doing so, she may also add something on tax policies and climate change. On this crucial, yet still very sensitive issue, we hosted together a G20 high-level tax symposium on tax policy and climate change a couple of days ago, where we discussed the effectiveness of tax policy in tackling climate change while mitigating economic and social costs of the transition borne by citizens and businesses. Alongside, World Bank colleagues coordinated a working group focusing on supporting the climate transition in emerging markets and developing economies. The global transition will be successful, fair, and just if all countries participate. International financial institutions, multilateral, regional, national, and other development banks have a key role to play in supporting climate action in vulnerable contexts. The World Bank is increasingly called to take the leadership in enhancing coordination among multilateral development banks in order to accelerate the full alignment of their operation with the Paris Agreement, as well as to maximize the collective impact of their action. MDBs play a crucial role in providing financial and technical resources to pursue a global, sustainable, and resilient recovery. Most importantly, such institutions are critical to leverage private finance while supporting the creation of a credible pipeline of investment projects for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. This is essential to catalyze innovation and create an investment-friendly environment in vulnerable contexts. In light of this, I look forward to hear more from David about the joint MDB proposals aimed at supporting countries in the preparation and implementation of long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies and at tackling barriers to larger-scale private investment in climate projects. Kristalina, you have the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I could not be more grateful to the Italian presidency for bringing us together today and starting us with Professor Nordhaus' presentation. For the benefit of full disclosure, I am a trained environmental economist. I have been studying your research, and I think it will show in what I have to say right now. So where do we start? We have to keep global temperatures below rising 1.5 to 2% level. To get to that point, we have to cut global emissions by 1/4 to 1/2 over the next decade. Based on our historical experience, as we saw in the slides, this may seem an impossible target, but it is one we ought to and we can achieve with public support, technological breakthroughs, and yes, the right policies. Our miserable performance so far has given ground to an interesting joke. How can we achieve sustainability and protect our climate? And the answer is there are two ways to do that. One is realistic and the other one is fantastic. The realistic way is extraterrestrials come from space, they take over our affairs, they do it. And the fantastic is we people, we do it ourselves. So your job as a presidency is to make the fantastic realistic. And we are here to help you do so. Why I think there is a pathway forward? First, because public awareness has gone up significantly. Recent global poll tells us that majority of people surveyed consider climate change a global emergency, with the level of concern highest in small island and developing states and in high-income countries at 74% and 72% accordingly, and well above 50% of people in middle-income and least developed countries also believe this is the case, 62% and 58%. Another poll tells us that during the pandemic, this concern has gone up, and actually many of us worried it would be the opposite. But actually people saw the pandemic as a reminder that we need to step up climate action. 43% of people surveyed recently said, we are more concerned now. Only 7% said we are less concerned. We also have seen during the pandemic the response of science being so powerful. We got vaccines in record times. We saw the response of policymakers being unprecedented in terms of fiscal and monetary policy action. And it is in this context, staff from several institutions came together and we worked on key policy priorities to cut emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And actually, I agree with Professor Nordhaus. It has to go beyond the Paris Agreement if we were to protect ourselves from being literally, basically being literally cooked. So, first priority, and I would echo what we just heard, make market signals work for the new climate economy, not against it. As politically challenging this may be, the world needs to get rid of all forms of fossil fuel subsidies. And if we define them broadly, not only direct subsidies, but also undercharging for supplies, environmental and health costs, they are equivalent to more than $5 trillion annually. And we are coming up with new research that would present the exact composition of these subsidies. And obviously, key is what we just heard from Professor Nordhaus, to put a robust price on carbon, as we actually discussed also at the tax symposium. To create that critical signal to redirect private investment and innovation to clean technology to incentivize energy efficiency. And our research is very clear. We simply cannot reach our goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius without carbon price. And this signal needs to be predictably getting stronger, reaching by 2030 an average global price of $75 a ton. Way up from where we are. And actually, Professor Nordhaus, a little piece of good news. With increased coverage from 18 to 23% of carbon emissions that are priced, it went from $2 a ton to $3 a ton. Now, we can say, hooray, 50% higher, or we can say, well, that is 25 times lower than it should be by 2030. A minimal first step on carbon pricing is a regular stock-taking of measures by the G20 countries to assess progress towards mitigation commitments. But we do believe we have to achieve a higher level of ambition, and you have heard me talking about that, introducing an international carbon price floor agreement among major emitters. It is very much in line with the price club we just heard about. What the difference is that what it presents is an opportunity to calibrate 4 different categories of countries where the carbon price floor is now and how we go up. And I do believe that emerging markets, developing countries, would not join unless there is this recognition that we are not equal, either by contribution to the problem or by the way we get out of it. With a pragmatic design, this type of arrangement would allow different minimum prices based on different development levels and different national policy approaches. And the carbon price floor does not have to be a tax. It could be cap and trade, or it could be even a combination of fee-based and regulations that produce the equivalency of that carbon price at sectoral and national level. And crucially, as we are making global mitigation efforts more effective, this price floor would address concerns about competitiveness that are already insensitizing carbon border adjustments. In our view, they are less effective and more divisive. But carbon pricing alone is not enough. It brings me to the second policy priority, green investments. Radically decarbonizing our economies will require a substantial scaling up of investments over the next 2 decades. The shift to renewables, new electricity networks, energy efficiency, low carbon mobility offers huge investment opportunities and a huge opportunity for green growth and green jobs. Our research shows that deficit-financed green supply policies could raise global GDP by about 2% this decade and create millions of new jobs. On average, around 30% of new investments have to come from public sources, the remaining 70% from private sources. And that means giving priority to green recovery packages, green budgeting, and green finance. And of course, international institutions have a role to play to reduce both costs and perceived risks. And I know that David would talk about it, so I would skip and go straight to the third priority. Professor Nordhaus didn't talk about it, but I will, and it is just transition within countries and across countries. Within countries, we must recognize decarbonization will impact vulnerable households, poor people, as well as businesses and workers currently deployed in sectors with high emissions. Fair compensation measures will be required. For example, revenues from carbon pricing could fund cash transfers, social safety nets, worker retraining, relocation schemes. And place-based policies can help develop new low-carbon industries and jobs through green investments. And across countries, we have to recognize we need to help the developing world. And this 100 billion a year that we're talking about, they must happen. And if they don't happen, there would be not only loss in momentum, but loss of trust, erosion of trust. And then these agreements that we talk about, they would be much harder to reach. Let me finish with us at the fund. We work very closely with partners on this agenda. With the bank, we formed a high-level advisory group on sustainable and inclusive development for policy analysis and proposals, concrete proposals down to country level to move the world forward. We are putting climate at the heart of our work, from country, regional, and global economic surveillance to capacity building to helping small island states with fiscal strategies that build resilience. Our board gave us a hand to cover climate in Article 4 and financial sector assessment programs. We would do it, mitigation for large emitters, adaptation for vulnerable countries, and of course, transition for countries with high carbon intensity economies. And earlier this year, we launched the new climate change indicator dashboard. We very much embrace the data gap initiative because good data lead to good policies. Now, beyond surveillance, you would say, put your money where your mouth is. And what we are now working on is considering with our membership whether the 650 billion of special drawing rights can give us an opportunity to move more financing in the right direction. We are exploring the creation of resilience and sustainability trust to support resilient and sustainable growth in the post-pandemic period, including resilience to climate change, lending at cheaper rates and longer maturities to provide fiscal space for countries to undertake green reforms and policies. And it could, especially for benefit low-income countries, poorer and vulnerable middle-income countries. And I look forward to discussing this with you. Leonardo da Vinci, since you talk about Venice, Leonardo da Vinci, who worked in Venice, said, "I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do." And I think today, hopefully, we get this sense of, yes, we can. And prove Professor Nordhaus' graph wrong, because it is going to turn the way you describe it, it should. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristalina. Now, David.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you, Ignacio, for the opening remarks, and to both of you for hosting. Thank you also to Professor Nordhaus for laying the stage, and Kristalina for those very interesting remarks. Our collective responses to poverty, inequality, and climate change are defining choices of our age. We must tackle them together to make progress on our mission of reducing poverty and boosting shared prosperity. The COVID-19 pandemic and economic losses have been devastating. We're providing maximum support to developing economies to respond to the crisis, and we're also working to help them recover in ways that will be sustainable, greener, and more prosperous. I've been very happy with the World Bank Group performance over the last 15 months, the 15 months of the pandemic, and our data shows that we've been able to mobilize and provide $157 billion in support over that 15-month period. So that's a record and a 60% growth over the previous 15 months. Much of the hard work ahead will have to be done at the country level. At the World Bank Group, we're making the GRID approach, green, resilient, and inclusive development, operational through multidisciplinary expertise. Mari Pangestu is here with me today as Managing Director in that part of the bank. Financing and support for implementation. Axel van Trotzenberg is here today with me, the Managing Director for operations and for operations. While we're doing everything we can so people in poorer countries can benefit from good development and climate outcomes. In 2020, the bank group provided more climate finance than ever. We accounted for over half of multilateral climate finance to developing countries and over 2/3 of the adaptation finance. In 2021, we're delivering even more. Our Climate Change Action Plan for 21 through 25 dedicates an average 35% of bank group financing over the next 5 years to climate action, with at least half of bank financing supporting adaptation and resilience efforts. We are aligning bank group financing with the Paris Agreement goals. The crux of our second Climate Change Action Plan is to help developing countries integrate climate considerations into their development strategies and to deploy climate finance in ways that achieve the most results in terms of actual mitigation, reduction in greenhouse gases, and actual adaptation, saving lives. We will help client countries in their efforts to develop and implement the NDCs and long-term strategies. We're enhancing our core analytical products, such as our recently launched Country Climate and Development Reports and a facility on climate-informed public expenditure reviews. These all work together and are critical in getting the job done. We need diagnostics and a data-driven approach to help prioritize action. One key metric is the extent to which an intervention bends the trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions. In this regard, we know we need to drive transformation in several key systems: energy, agriculture, food and water, land, transport, and manufacturing. Together, these systems generate over 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions and also face significant adaptation challenges. They are major contributors to economic growth and development, so there has to be an integration of climate and development goals and policies. Our action plan describes areas and techniques where we think countries and private sector clients can achieve impact, and recognizes that the costs to manage these transitions will often be large compared to available resources. Our newly announced country climate and diagnostic reports, I'll call them CCDRs, will be an important tool to help us prioritize and sequence climate action in our client countries. They will investigate how climate change impacts a country's development path, and they will identify mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building to improve development outcomes. Over the next year, we plan to complete up to 25 of these CCDRs, focusing for the first round on developing countries with particularly large carbon emissions and/or great climate vulnerabilities. The world's poorest countries, those are our IDA borrowers, account for less than 1/10 of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they're the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, droughts, flooding, and coastal erosion. The majority of IDA countries' emissions, about 40% of them, come from agriculture sector, a sector that's not only the largest contributor to these countries' GDP, but one that underpins the livelihood of the poorest people. 80% of the world's poor reside in rural areas and rely on agriculture for their livelihood. At the same time, these countries have the lowest energy access levels and a weak manufacturing base. So we need to consider climate interventions for countries at different stages in their development. Some of the highest emitters need to achieve a just transition from coal and find ways to reduce emissions from heavy industry through new technologies such as carbon capture and storage. And for the poorest countries, as we continue to support sectors critical for their economic growth, we need to identify ways to help their growth and environmental practices become sustainable. As an example, $420 million climate-smart agriculture project we financed in Maharashtra, India, which supported 310,000 farmers in adopting climate-smart agricultural practices. The project is expected to reduce climate-related crop failures and eventually benefit 7 million people in a region prone to severe drought. As we scale up our financing and sharpen our focus on impact, we need equitable and practical ways to balance growth and climate imperatives. This is why in our action plan, and as part of our commitment to align our financing flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement, we're increasing our support for countries to develop meaningful and impactful NDCs and LTSs that take into account their development needs. To date, we've already supported over 50 countries on their NDCs, from Mongolia to Mozambique and from Congo to Chile, and we're allocating more resources for this in coming years. We also need a parallel effort to protect our natural capital and biodiversity so that solutions work for people and the planet. Nature offers some of the best solutions to the climate crisis. Mangrove forests, for example, help sequester carbon and avoid over $80 billion a year in losses from coastal flooding. As climate change and desertification threaten livelihoods across the Sahel, the World Bank plans to invest over $5 billion over the next 5 years to help restore degraded landscapes and improve agricultural productivity in 11 countries on an expanse that stretches from Senegal to Djibouti. As a global community, we need to be willing to address some of the most challenging climate problems. For example, 250 or more gigawatts of coal-fired plants could come online in the near to medium term, mostly in Asia. Halting these and decommissioning existing polluting coal-fired plants will be expensive. Who will bear the cost and any losses? Almost 50% of global CO2 equivalent emissions come from the combined energy and heavy industry sectors in just China, the US, and India. How will transformations be incentivized and funded? If public companies decide to divest fossil fuel assets, will the assets simply move to new ownership? And if fossil fuel emitters are shuttered, how can we ensure that the raw material is not simply exported and emitted elsewhere? As the world works to develop low-carbon energy sources that are reliable, easily stored and deployed commercially and at scale, how do we support the poorest countries in achieving their energy access goals and SDG 7 for electricity access? And how can we mobilize and incentivize the private sector to engage in providing global public goods, for example, foregoing coal, or adaptation whose costs are incurred upfront, but whose benefits accrue over time? As I discussed in detail on Friday at our events, a key problem and challenge is how to change incentives in taxes and subsidies. Both Professor Nordhaus and Kristalina mentioned this. It's core. Carbon taxes and reduced subsidies have emerged as the most impactful explicit carbon pricing instrument, but this will require political will and consensus. Both the private and public sectors have important roles to play in providing answers. We need to tackle the low-hanging fruit, such as investing in climate-smart agriculture and livestock, better regulation for high-emitting second-hand vehicles, fleet management, investing in energy efficiency, among others, and supporting the enabling environment for bold ideas. Technological improvements, including energy efficiency, battery storage, hydrogen, nuclear developments, carbon storage, and decarbonization techniques will be important determinants for low-carbon transitions around the world. IFC and MEGA are mobilizing private sector financing and helping companies lower their emissions. A recent example is IFC's financing of one of the largest gas flaring reduction projects in the world in Iraq, where we mobilized 8 international banks to finance the world's first green loan dedicated to gas flaring reduction. And so, with that, in sum, I'm very pleased to be here today to affirm and reaffirm the World Bank Group's strong commitment to work with all stakeholders, public and private, to advance the integration of climate and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kristalina. Thank you for your contribution today and for all the work you are doing for the G20. Thanks a lot.
We are now reconvening for our morning policy panel. The panel will focus on global coordination and on the best policy mix that both emerging and advanced countries can put in place to accelerate the transition towards carbon-neutral economies and societies. The panel will be animated by very distinguished guests who will share with us their experiences and views to better coordinate our climate action. Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance of Indonesia, Martin Guzman, Minister of Finance of Argentina, Agustin Carstens, General Manager of the Bank of International Settlements, Laura Cozzi, Chief Energy Modeler at the International Energy Agency, Odile Renaud-Bassot, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Jean Likun, President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Lind Berridge, Professor at the University of California. The panel will be moderated by Gillian Tett, journalist and chair of the editorial board at the Financial Times.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great honor to have been asked by the Banco d'Italia and the Finance Ministry to moderate this incredibly important panel. I often think that the role of financial columnists and academics at these types of events is to act a bit like the fool in a Shakespearean play. We're here to ask the idiot questions, to speak truth to power, and maybe to entertain you a bit. And in that respect, I think that the challenges that Professor Nordhaus laid out clearly are both very sobering and represent a strong call to arms. In fact, in some ways, speaking as the fool, I would say that for the G20, we're currently in a multi-act drama. Act 1 was after the great financial crisis, when the G20 did respond quite effectively to the challenges then. Act 2, in some ways, was during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the G20 has scrambled to try and create some coordinated policies with somewhat more mixed success. Act 3, in some ways, occurred just yesterday in the discussions about the coordinated corporate tax initiatives. Again, the full fruits of that have yet to be seen. And Act 4 is now looking at the climate challenges that in many ways are the hardest one of all. Because the good news is that it is clear that almost everybody on the international stage now recognizes the need to act to avert climate change. The other bit of good news is I think most people recognize, as Professor Nordhaus described so eloquently, that current policies are failing to avert global warming effectively. There's also widespread recognition that there needs to be significant shifts and discussion around things like carbon taxes. And I would imagine that, speaking as a fool again, one of the key aims of today is to try and get the G20 to rally behind carbon taxes in an effective way and behind mechanisms to ensure that more money flows to the groups of people who are going to suffer from carbon taxes and flows into the technology and the research needed to mitigate the impact of climate change. But the bad news is that it's still very unclear whether there is a consensus or not. It's very unclear how carbon taxes can be structured, if they can be structured, in a way that both avoids the cross-border conflict as a result of measures such as the EU one recently announced or going to be announced this week. It's unclear how to ensure that we get some level of domestic political support in America for that. It's unclear how to alleviate the very understandable concerns that emerging market countries have towards issues like this. And it's also unclear how to get money flowing on the scale needed to the emerging markets to actually have the investments that we need into renewable technologies and also to cope with vulnerable populations. Is there more of a role for multilateral development banks? Could groups like the World Bank play a more imaginative role with things like blended finance? What exactly are the private markets going to do in relation to this? These are all crucial questions which we're going to try and address in the next 90 minutes. So we have a very distinguished panel to talk to you about this, half of whom are here. The other half are going to be floating above your heads in cyberspace. But we're going to start with somebody who is here with us today, Augustin Carstens from the Bank for International Settlements. And I'd like to hear from you for about 5 minutes. In your view, what are the key levers and mechanisms that we need now to ensure that there is sufficiently rapid effort to mitigate and halt climate change?
Well, thank you very much, Gillian. Great being in a panel with you and with Martin Odile and Idrowati and everybody. And thank very much, Ignacio, Daniel, for organizing this panel and devoting a day to this key topic. I mean, as you said, the challenge is enormous, and therefore we need to use every single good idea that is out there. It is impossible to think that we will be able to fill the gap or to really cover the ground that is needed, in particular that we are starting already late. I mean, a way, I think a way to conceptualize the huge challenge that we face is that we need to engineer a huge reallocation of resources across sectors, across times, across countries. Usually reallocation of resources is tremendously difficult, and it's very difficult to organize it in a very short period of time. I mean, just think about where we are today with COVID-19. The solution of COVID-19 requires huge reallocation of resources, and that has been compounded by technological change and globalization. We see many sectors suffering. So, I mean, I think first we need to realize that it will not be an easy task, and therefore we need to use carbon taxes, we need to use offsets, we need to use all the political instruments that are there, all the instruments that we have at the international level. I mean, for that you mentioned multilateral development banks, and yes, that's essential. Why? Because in the margin of reallocation resources across countries, that probably is one of the most effective ways. The other major issue for reallocating resources is markets. And one in particular that I'm the most familiar with is financial markets. I mean, a way to characterize financial markets is precisely the place where resources travel to time and they are reallocated. And in that way, I think that there is a huge task to make sustainable finance sustainable, and to just work towards the financial market, provide much better signals to reallocate. I think benchmarking at the corporate level will be very, very important. I think what we want is markets to make a differentiation in terms of performance, in terms of return. And for that, it's essential that we provide the infrastructure that is needed for that signaling mechanism to work. Today, I have to say, we don't have the signaling mechanism. We are working towards I would say, the infrastructure, the taxonomies, and so on and so forth. I think a key challenge that we will face into the future is that we're starting in a gradual way without much a mapping of the information requirements to the final goal of really making a dent on the climate issue. I mean, I see it a little bit as inflation targeting. That is a terrain that we central banks are familiar with. We have a clear goal, which is inflation targeting, and therefore you need to organize yourself so that you have incidence in that margin. Here, I don't see that transmission clearly, and I think we have to work towards that. So we need to work in all fields.
So thank you very much indeed. Before I came up to the panel, one of the participants begged me to avoid mush, to avoid too much ambiguous talking on this panel. So let me ask you specifically, as part of your call for more clarity, like we have with inflation targeting, would you support measures to introduce a carbon price at the BIS?
Yeah, I mean, I think carbon pricing is essential. I don't have a doubt that we need to do it. It has huge implications. It's not an easy market to organize because it's more than anything how to deal with externalities. And it gets very quickly into mixtures with the traditional fiscal instruments like taxes and subsidies. And to organize that across nations is very, very difficult. But yes, there is no other way around it.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn now to Minister Indrawati from Indonesia, who I hope is floating above my head somewhere in the ether. You can probably see her. Yes, fantastic. Because Indonesia is in a very interesting position. I mean, first of all, Minister, you're in an interesting position, having worked in the multilateral development bank institutions yourself, but you're now, of course, Minister of Indonesia, which is a country that is more than 50% dependent on coal for your energy needs, and yet you have courageously talked about introducing a carbon price in Indonesia, I believe, of about $5.2 a ton, higher than Singapore, which is quite remarkable. Unsurprisingly, has sparked quite a lot of domestic debate, to put it politely. So I'm very curious, from your perspective, what are the key levers or mechanisms that need to be adopted today to actually introduce the proper levels of transition required? And is there enough financing available for a country like yourself to actually do this? If not, what would you like to see from the multilateral development banks?
Well, thank you, Gillian. I think when we are talking about levers, we really have to look at, in one country, the ecosystem in place, whether you have a clarity in terms of plan and strategy to deal with this climate change, the national determined commitment, as well as how we are going to go to the net zero emission. And that really need a signaling from the government, whether there is a political commitment, there is a strategy, there is a plan, a program, policy in place. Now, for Indonesia, we know that the whole ecosystem is still in the process of building it. So one of it that you mentioned is the carbon price and carbon tax. We are still in the process of now legislating with the parliament to discuss about the carbon tax. And the carbon price, we have a government regulation that will be built. Now, the question about the carbon price as part of the market mechanism to deal with this carbon emission or the climate change challenge, that means that you really have to make sure there is a market mechanism that is credible and working within the country and across the country. And that is something that really needs to be done. If we are continue waiting, it's not going to come. Each country should have their own initiative. In this case, Indonesia is starting to build those mechanisms in place, the price as well as the market mechanism. We deal with what institution should be a regulator. There is an issue, as Agustin mentioned, about the data, as well as how we are going to track. And that is something which is really a lot of technical competency that need to be in place. So this is what the Indonesia trying to do in order for us to be able to increase or to lever, what you call it, public finance, which is in place to transform from the current path of the carbon emission development into a lower carbon or net zero emission. It will require a huge investment cost. You mentioned about the coal energy in this case. For Indonesia to change into renewable, that will require a lot of many instruments in place. First, the coal itself, the contract is usually very long, multi-years. So how you are going to deal with this, the independent power purchase contract. The second one is how you are going to convert into a renewable today. If the economy growing, then the demand for energy is going to grow. And that means the additional demand should be fulfilled with this more renewable, which is most of the time, for example, like geothermal, it will require a huge front-loading capital spending, as well as some risks that need to be addressed. And that's required quite a lot of policy on the fiscal side, whether this is in the form of guarantee, whether this is in the form of incentive for them to be able to explore. Then you also have to deal with the capacity for you to be able to transform this from non-renewable into renewable. Now, this kind of huge investment cost cannot be done by public funding only. Investment from the private sector is very critical. The question that you asked, how we are going to catalyze this investment from the private sector. The role of our own policy is very critical. Where we are going from here, what kind of signaling, what kind of incentive that you are going to provide. The second one, multilateral development bank can also do the same thing. They can help country to prepare a good, sound, green project, in this case, that will allow this to then develop and create what you call it, a credibility as well as reputation. For us also, is also dealing with diversifying our instrument financing. Green bond that we issue. Agustin mentioned earlier that the today pricing is not differentiated. That is so true. We issued 3.5 billion green bonds since 2018. The yield is not reflected that you are actually appreciated by the market that this is actually for a green project. So if the market globally is going to work more properly, it should reflect this kind of differentiated price between what you call it, the regular ordinary bonds with the bonds which is dedicated for the green project or related to that. This is exactly what Agustin mentioned. Reallocation of resources toward a more what you call it climate change instrument is going to be very critical. And I think that can be done with the policy, political level, of course, commitment, policy, as well as a plan or program signaling from the government. But market will play a very important role. That's why Indonesia believes that carbon price and market mechanism for carbon should be there. Indonesia is still at the very early stage, so we are not claiming that it is going to be easy and successful. But I think we need to start. And we believe that this will complement the government-owned program and policy, and also all the incentive provided so that we are going to be able to transform from the current trajectory of the investment into a more climate change friendly investment trajectory. And that is really what we are trying to do at this very moment, Gillian. I hope that helped.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I just have a couple of questions before I move on to Professor Barrage. Firstly, Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF said that it would make sense to have a multi-tiered approach towards some type of carbon price, carbon tax, global regime. Is that something that you would also endorse? And do you see using SDRs or other forms of catalytic capital as one way to go forward with these significant investments that you need?
Well, one size fits all doesn't work. That's definitely true. But unfortunately, we are dealing with the climate change in which we are dealing with one equal same commodity, that is carbon, for the whole world. So ideally, it should be one price. But we also know that the world consists of many jurisdictions which is not yet that prepared or ready or able. So we really have, as a technocratic design, how you are going to make sure that many and more country is going to be on board, given the fact that they are not always ready, whether this is politically, whether this is competency, whether this is institutional setting. So we really have to be able to reflect that on this kind of commitment and not singling out, not in this is simply vying. The second one, I think the credibility is very important. You mentioned about the SDR, but also multilateral development bank. I think at the end, many emerging countries as well developing countries, they are asking, with this 100 billion which is committed in the Paris Agreement, they are not yet there. And then now we're talking about trillion of money. So the question is more like a credibility building on what is really can be delivered. And that will create more confidence where we are going from here, that this is path is going to be different. So more and more countries will be committed. And so I think on the SDR, this is IMF instrument, and that's why it is related to how the IMF is going to work with member country, where this is going to be in the form of program or any other mechanism that is going to like help many emerging and developing countries. For the multilateral development bank, I think they have more diversified instrument, whether this is money, whether this is knowledge, as well as convening factors. And I think given the need is huge in this climate change, and combined with post-COVID, in which fiscal space is going to be limited, challenge on the poverty reduction, which is still continue relevant at this very moment. So we really need to have a huge resource. The question is how you are going to mobilize resource and how this is going to be linked with the private sector, which actually have 100 trillion with a low interest rate at this very moment. So I think this is going to be the strategy that need to be done at the global level, but be very mindful that the world consists of so many diverse in terms of capacity and development of many countries that need to be accommodated for us to be able to have a global successful commitment and delivery.
And just, do you have any back of the envelope calculation for what Indonesia needs in terms of resources?
we have from our own budget. If we look at because we also develop what you call it the budget tagging. With our own budget, we only provide around 32% what is needed for our own national determined contribution, which is already in place on this climate agreement in Paris. And that's definitely will not be adequate. We now, for example, establishing sovereign wealth fund. We also try to mobilize through the equity financing so that we are not going to be burdened by excessive debt. And at the same time, private sector is still at the very, very early stage on their participation. So this is really a critical time for Indonesia, for us to be able to not only fulfill the rest of the 70 or around 65%, which is need to be delivered in order for us to be able to deliver this national determined contribution, not to mention if we have more ambitious target of the zero emission, which should be come up earlier. And that's why we are going to require huge resources.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Minister Indrawati, and I think you illustrate very well from the perspective of one country the broader challenges. But I'd like to turn now to Professor Baraj, who's speaking to us from California at a very early hour, I believe, who's going to be talking to us from her perspective as an American academic about what levers are the most important and the role of carbon taxes in this respect.
Thank you, Gillian. So I'd like to highlight three core advantages that carbon pricing has over regulatory approaches to addressing climate change. The first is that carbon pricing can achieve emissions reductions at significantly lower costs than regulatory approaches. And different studies have found this to be true both with focus on specific sectors such as vehicle emissions and for the overall economy. So for example, a recent consulting study in the United States compared two different ways of reducing emissions by 50% by 2035. One tool was a carbon tax of $40 per ton, rising at 5% per year. The other was a package of different regulations, including clean energy standards, mandates for carbon capture and storage, clean efficiency standards, etc. And the study found that by 2035, if emissions reductions were achieved with a carbon price, GDP was 1.5% higher. So this suggests that the potential cost savings from using a carbon price mechanism may be quite substantial. A second key advantage I'd like to note is the importance of the revenues that carbon pricing tools can raise. Such revenues can be used to address concerns about regressivity impacts on low-income households, on negative profit impacts on some of the most vulnerable industries, as well as general concerns about economic competitiveness. So recent modeling work out of Stanford University, for example, focusing again on the United States, has found that it takes only a fraction of revenues raised with carbon taxes to fully offset regressivity or negative impacts on low-income households. It also requires only a fraction of revenues to compensate to some extent the most vulnerable industries for profit losses. In addition, leftover or revenues more broadly raised by carbon taxes or other carbon pricing tools can be used to reduce other economically costly tax rates. And studies have found that this can potentially increase GDP or significantly decrease the costs of carbon pricing policies, even without taking environmental benefits into account. A third important advantage of carbon pricing I would like to note is, as Professor Nordhaus mentioned this morning, the fact that carbon pricing can be immensely helpful in providing incentives for clean energy research and development, provided that the carbon price signal is sufficiently strong and sufficiently broad. So it's empirically well established that higher fossil energy prices lead to increases in innovation in both energy efficiency and clean technologies. Now, unfortunately, this is another area where there's a large gap between policy aspirations and the current economic reality. As we have seen over the past 20 years, initially in the early mid-2000s, increases in green innovation, but since around the mid-2000s, we've seen in many advanced economies sharp declines in, for example, the fraction of patents that pertain to renewable electricity generation. In the United States, for example, the ratio of patents filed that pertain to renewable versus fossil fuel electricity generation has fallen from a high of 2 in the mid-2000s to less than 1 in 2016. So now fossil fuel electricity patenting again outweighs green patenting. This is reflective of the fact that currently incentives for green innovation are grossly insufficient. Again, a broad, sufficiently strong carbon price can help redress this, along with the need for explicit fiscal support for clean tech R&D. Both of these, as Professor Nordhaus mentioned this morning, are going to be essential in meeting the challenges that lie ahead.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Barrage. You're speaking to us, obviously, as an independent American academic, but you obviously have had plenty of contact before with people around the current administration and have had an impact on the policy debate in America. So before I move on, I'd like to ask you two quick questions. Firstly, why has the administration of President Biden not endorsed or backed a carbon price or carbon tax policy yet, given that people like Secretary Yellen previously wrote papers with Mark Carney just last year, I believe, essentially pointing out the very beneficial impact of that. And secondly, is there anything that you think could actually change the domestic political considerations at the moment to bring the Republicans, other people who have hitherto been opposed to a carbon price or tax on board within the American context? I think that's a question that many people around the world are wondering right now, particularly in Europe.
Thank you for this question. I certainly cannot speak for the Biden administration, but my understanding is that some of the concerns that currently exist around both carbon pricing and in recent debates about increasing gasoline taxes, for example, include both the political viability of carbon pricing or the lack thereof, and concerns about regressivity and impacts on poor, lower income households. So, and again, these concerns about regressivity can be addressed using revenues raised by carbon pricing instruments, but the political viability is a concern. Now, as far as Republican support for carbon pricing, there's heterogeneity within the Republican Party, and certainly some Republicans have joined in supporting proposals for carbon pricing, in particular if that is potentially introduced as a swap in lieu of combined regulatory approaches, which, again, there's economic cost savings to be had from using a carbon price instead of combined regulatory approaches. But it's beyond my expertise to speak about the political environment in the United States, but certainly this is a concern.
I think it's probably beyond the expertise of most people to make sense of the political environment at the moment in the United States. But certainly just an observation in my role as being a fool in this great drama, it seems that if you start using the word rebate instead of tax for the climate change discussions in the American context, you may actually get further in actually trying to get some kind of bipartisan agreement there. But I'd like to bring in now Ms. Laura Cozy from the International Energy Agency to make some remarks. The IEA caused quite a stir recently by coming out and essentially stating for the first time the obvious, that there needed to be really quite dramatic changes in energy investments and policies to have any hope of hitting the Paris Climate Change Accord. You calculated you're going to need $5 trillion a year annually for the foreseeable future to basically support the transitions needed to hit the goals, which is an extraordinary amount of money. And you also said there could be no new oil and gas investment, which again is an astonishing thing for the IEA to have come out and said. I'm curious to hear from you what you think are the key levers, mechanisms to actually make this happen, and where that $5 trillion a year will be actually found from in terms of the money flows. And also, I'd love to know whether the IEA would explicitly support the use of a carbon price or carbon tax, like the BIS and IMF.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And indeed, a few months ago, on the 18th of May, we released a roadmap that was trying to put some clarity of what is needed from the energy sector to actually reach net zero emission by 2050, which is what is needed if we want to meet the Paris Agreement. And I think the key finding of our analysis is that the pathway to reach net zero by 2050 is narrow, but is still achievable. And this decade is really the decade of action. Why did we say and find that the pathway to net zero by 2050 is narrow but achievable? We looked at really what's needed sector by sector to cut emissions by a third, which is what is needed for the energy sector that accounts for 3/4 of emissions today. And the good news is that we do have all the technologies that are required to achieve the reduction cuts for this decade at our hands. First point. Second point, we know which policies work to push those technologies in the markets. What are we talking about to be more concrete? We are talking about pushing first and foremost the electricity sector to go to net zero. And today, globally, solar, wind, we heard from Indonesia, geothermal are the cheapest forms of producing electricity in the planet. This was not the case 5 years ago. Last year, 90% of new power generation installed in the planet was renewables. So we are getting there. We are getting towards the investments and the market to actually move those investments towards the greener alternative. This is for what concerns the electricity sector. Second, once we push decarbonization of the electricity sector, we have a very clean energy vector that can be used in many, many applications. For example, cars. If we look at what is happening in the automotive industry, it's astonishing. Over the past 2 years, basically all of the major car manufacturers have put forward electric vehicles as one of their car in the market. And the sales that we are tracking at the beginning of this year are over 10% in Europe, 6% globally, first quarter of this year, compared to just 1% couple of years ago. So we are really in the cusp of this technology revolution. And in some cases, what's happening is that this technology is already cheaper than the alternative. So first pillar, move very, very strongly on the decarbonization of the electricity sector. Second, electrify as much as possible. Third pillar is the energy efficiency. And I would push forward here energy efficiency in buildings in advanced economies. Again, we have the technology. We could use workers that are currently laid off to rebuild and make more efficient some of our building infrastructure. How much money do we need? You mentioned this, Gillian. Actually, the executive director mentioned this already at the Biden summit at the beginning of the year. We need to triple clean energy investment compared to today's level. So we have currently around 1.2 trillion going to clean energy investment. We will need to reach above 4 trillion by 2030. Clearly, this has to come from a variety of sources. We cannot expect just the public sector to cover for that. The private money needs to flow very, very strongly. But as I said earlier, we see pipelines of projects, especially in renewables, being ready to be deployed. It's about ensuring the cost of capital being low. And it's about governments, as Indonesia just rightly pointed out, to put the right energy policy in place. Now, third and important point for us is about just transitions. There are 3 elements here to be considered. First, the amount of money, the increase that we need to see in emerging markets is larger than what we need to see in advanced economies. So this has to be our front and center of attention. An analysis done together with the World Bank less than a month ago, we said that this could be the critical fault line in achieving our global climate goals. So we need to support emerging countries to make the necessary investment. In our view, the 100 billion that has been put forward by advanced economies has to be seen as the flow, but clearly we need to work in coordination to make sure that the cost of capital for this transition for the green alternative is lowered. Second point is jobs. we see potentially, analysis done with together with the International Monetary Fund, a pipeline of new 30 million workers globally in the clean energy sector. This is huge. Big news for the energy sector, but what we are worried about is the 5 million potential job losses in two key sectors, mostly coal, and we are worried about those communities, those countries, those regions that are reliant on those revenues. And this is the attention of a global commission that we have instituted with Prime Minister of Denmark to make sure that we talk with the countries, with the communities, and we make sure that there are measures already in place now to ensure just transition there. Second element of the just transition, advanced economies need to lead the way. We need to get to net zero earlier than emerging economies to make forward a credible plan, put forward that is possible, and make the technology available earlier to then be transferred to emerging economies. The third point is about electricity access. We are talking about going to net zero emissions, but we shouldn't forget there are 850 million people currently today, as we're speaking, without access to electricity, meaning without access to digital, without access to knowledge. This has to be part, absolutely, of the COP agreement this year to ensure equitable and fair transitions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I just have a couple of questions before we turn to the next panelist, which is, firstly, do you think that the advanced economies are willing to make the sacrifices or have the political will to go first in terms of bearing most of the burden initially of any transition, given what you've said about the need for the advanced economies to go first before the emerging markets? Do you think there is actually currently the will for that? Well, let me start with that.
I think in the discussions we are having at the IEA and bilateral discussions, we see a lot of momentum. The NDCs have been raised very significantly compared to what we have seen a couple of years ago. 70% of the global emissions currently have net zero targets. Basically, all of the advanced economies have put this target forward. I think that this is very significant ahead of COP. I think the next step has to be some financial signal. So I think that in terms of domestic action and raising ambition, most of the advanced economies over the past year have really put forward their cards and raised the ambition. This is certainly what we are seeing.
And what do you see as being the key block to stop the money flowing into that $4 trillion financing need at the moment? Because $4 trillion sounds like a lot, but it's actually tiny compared to the amount of money that's sitting around the world, somewhat idle in the capital markets. You know, in your view, what are the key blocks preventing that money moving into those investment needs?
So you are completely right, Gillian. The money is out there. And when we talk increasingly with investors, they actually tell us that the appetite for green investment is very, very high. So what we need to do is to make sure that there are bankable projects on the ground. I really would like to commend the Indonesian minister, making sure that the energy policy on the ground is stable, is certain, will just make the money flow automatically. The other second aspect, we have made this huge review of cost of capitals. We are living in an incredible period in advanced economies with the very, very low cost of capital today, which will push and accelerate certainly even further the clean energy transition. This is not the case in emerging economies. There has to be there really a concerted effort to make sure that the cost of capital for the green and cleaner energy technologies is brought down. We are going to live over the next decade a transition from a global economy where you shift actually from energy to capital. And we need to make sure that this capital cost is brought down to ensure that we see this shift. So I would say that the multilateral banks, we have heard a lot about carbon prices and carbon taxes, certainly very important, but let's don't go to have the perfect being enemy of the good. Focusing on lowering carbon, the capital cost is going to be really, really the key to unlock the private capital that we need to reach the trillions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to turn now to Mr. Jin, the president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is currently in a very interesting structural position from my perspective, again, speaking as a journalistic fool. The AIIB, from its inception, has promoted clean energy and renewable energy, and as I understand it, has refrained from investing in any coal-fired operations at all. And yet, the founding country which was behind the AIIB's creation is China, which is obviously viewed by many people around the world as a key source of not just carbon emissions, but coal usage. So I'd love to hear from you, Mr. Jin, President Jin, what you see as being the key levers for change at the moment in terms of moving towards net zero. And to what degree do you think your work in actually promoting clean energy investment can lead to a wider shift in Chinese policy?
Thank you very much. I like to focus on a couple of points, based on your question. First is the mandate of the bank, and then the major shareholders, including China, who are backing the development and the management of this institution, and how we try to converge our views with regard to the efforts to deal with climate change. First of all, as you know, the bank was up and running in January 2016, just a couple of months after the Paris Agreement. So we've been created against the background of the international support for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So this is very much embedded in our Paris Agreement, in our mandate. The bank's mandate is to promote the economic and social development of the member countries, and particularly the low-income countries, and through connectivity, through integration in a global economy. And in this regard, it is clearly mandated that we should do our very best to rise to the challenge of climate change. So from the very beginning, we focus very much on the infrastructure which should be built with an aim to improve environment and mitigate emissions. So this is very much clear, and we don't think it is right for us to do the infrastructure investment in the traditional way. We have to incorporate high-tech technology to use the energy efficiency technology to reduce emissions, and our efforts to promote renewables is very much important. Now, China and many European countries, as the major shareholders of the institution, are very much dedicated to support these efforts, and we are in full agreement either in the internal management or the board. We should try our very best to do this. Now, you referred to the situations in China. As you know, the Chinese leader announced not long ago that China aims at the carbon peaking by 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It's very much clearly announced, and I would say China would be able to do it. So we have the full backing of all of the shareholders, including China. Now, with regard to the developing countries, for instance, the major shareholders of this bank, China, India, Indonesia, and all these developing countries, first of all, they are countries of a large population. They are in the process of industrialization. They have not yet moved to the post-industrialization era. So dealing with emission is definitely a challenge for these economies. But you could feel comfortable that all of these countries are very much dedicated, as Minister Suri Muryani just said. All these countries are very, very much committed to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So let me stop here, and if you may have some other questions.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for that very interesting intervention. I'm curious, do you as a bank, as the AIIB, have a perspective on carbon price and carbon taxes? Would you join with the IMF in saying that this should be an essential part of any policy program going forward? And would you want a multi-tiered approach, as the IMF is currently calling for? And secondly, the question is, what role do you see for catalytic capital or for blended finance? And could you join forces with other multilateral development banks to try and take a joint approach in that respect?
First of all, as you know, we certainly welcome IMF's announcement about the carbon taxation and carbon pricing. But essentially, this is the responsibility of the sovereign governments with regard to this. And I think the multilateral development banks, IFIs, have the moral support, should have the moral support for this. Once there's consensus on the international level, I think all of the IFIs and MDBs would be supportive, and in their financing, they would certainly follow. So we are looking forward to the development in this regard to see whether the governments, sovereign governments, developed countries can quickly reach consensus on how this is going to be done. Now, with regard to the financing for climate change and mitigation and adaptation, we are already working very closely with the other multilateral institutions. Give you some of the numbers. And in 2020, 8 MDBs, multilateral development banks, financed $66 billion for that purpose. And with co-financing, the total amount, the amount is $85 billion. So total, the financing from the multilateral development banks in 2020 is $151 billion. We have worked very closely with the World Bank, ADB, and also work with EBRD to co-finance for the purpose of dealing with the climate change. So international multilateral development banks are already working together in collaboration. And I'm sure that moving forward, we should do more, because one bank's power is limited. And total financing done by any institution is limited. Only by leveraging our resources and working with the private sector could it be possible for us to mobilize the maximum amount of financing and to address climate change.
Right, thank you. Just one other quick question before I turn to Ms. Odile Renaud-Boisseau from the EBRD. I'm curious, when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is obviously one part of the developing world, which has attracted a lot of attention, there have been a lot of plans for coal-fired power generation in the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you expect that to stop?
I'm not in the Chinese government anymore. I can certainly speak on behalf of the Chinese government. But as you know, in some of the international forums, likely in recent Boao conference in Hainan province, in some of the roundtable discussions which I participated, we also discussed this issue. As you know, we in AIB have made it very much clear we are not going to finance any coal firing power plants or any project which are functionally related to coal. And indeed, ever since we were up and running, we never ever financed any coal projects, and we won't do that. Now, with regard to the Belt Road programs, I think it certainly it's the idea of the Chinese government and how to cooperate with the other members of the international community to finance global integration, regional integration through connectivity. And during the meetings, I also have heard that the Chinese are very clear about the importance of not to export coal technology and should do as much as possible to finance renewables. And I think this is certainly something which should be very much welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it seems like a good moment to bring in Ms. Renaud-Boisseau from the EBRD, which of course has been also promoting clean energy transitions across the area that you are regions you're supporting. Can you give us your perspective about how you're trying to do that? What are the key levers or mechanisms to try and promote a green transition? And I'm also particularly curious, given that you are working within the European framework, which has taken a fairly hardline stance in the definition of what is or is not green. We've had the European Investment Bank, for example, refusing to invest even in gas. I'm curious how you define what is green transition from the EBRD perspective.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the Italian presidency for organizing this very interesting day on climate. So what we are doing as EBRD is, first of all, we are, as a development bank, providing financing, and we have very clear objectives in terms of financing the transition. Last year, we decided to be, we set the objective to have 50% of our investment in the green area, so to be majority green. And last week, we decided to move towards full Paris alignment by the end of 2022, which means that all our financing will be, all the projects should be consistent with the Paris Agreement. And this is an important step forward because it means it's for our direct financing, but everything also we do with financial institutions, through the banking system and so forth. So this is a bit of, we launch ourselves in this journey. I think it will be a long journey because there is a lot of methodological issues on which we've been working with all the MDBs to define what does it mean. And we'll have to refine, to learn by doing in a way. That's important for us also because we are intervening in countries, our countries of operation have a big issue with green transition. Overall, on average, their carbon intensity is 30% above world average. So it means that they have a huge task to green their energy mix and their policies. And the third point I wanted to make is we are a bank which has been set up to finance primarily the private sector. 75% of our financing should be in the private sector. So we are very much at the core, the core of what we should do to have private projects in these areas and not only public infrastructure projects and so forth. To be, looking forward, I think to make progress in this and to be able to deliver and listening to Professor Nordos, we see how big the challenge is and how little we have achieved so far. I think that we need to focus on three concrete steps. The first one is very much related to what Sri Mulani was saying this morning, which is the importance of having the right policies at the country levels and the right incentive, a clear regulatory framework, a clear strategy towards net zero emission and so forth. And this is a place where MDBs can have a very important role to play, because it's difficult to do that in developed countries, but it's even more difficult. And the know-how, the strategic skills, technicalities, and so forth are huge. And I think MDBs really have a huge task to provide some support, technical assistance for countries to develop these national determined contribution, long-term strategies, which are the key tools of the Paris Agreement, and which will be key if we want to be able to attract private financing. Because if there is no clarity about what is the long-term objective, how you will go about that, what will be the sectoral implication, there will be no investment. So I think that's a very important pillar, and what we are trying to do among the MDBs is to get ourselves a bit organized to cooperate on that, to avoid that we are all doing the same studies, and so really to get a sort of strong coordination mechanism to get this thing working. The second big challenge is to attract the private sector. MDBs can do a lot with their balance sheet, but it's not unlimited, and shareholders are, willing to maximize the impact and to get, we need to get the private sector. And one very important thing is to understand what the private sector investors for in emerging and developing countries need to get investment. We will hear this afternoon there is now a big money flying to developed economies in the green area. It's not already the case in the private sector, in the developing countries, emerging countries. And that's why I think we need really to work at the countries level with private sectors to understand what is needed to unlock investment. And this is something we can do with what is called country platform, having a really climate-focused discussion with the government, with MDBs, with the private sector on what is needed in terms of policy making, signaling, regulatory framework, how to, for example, what is the process for authorizing new investment. Sometimes it's very cumbersome, very long, and so forth. So what is needed concretely to unlock investment capacities and private sector money. And in that sense, MDBs can play a very important role in brokering these dialogues. And we are really committed to do that. The last point I wanted to make is the importance, and it goes a bit beyond our scope, but I think we can help moving in that direction with all the policy discussion we have with our countries of operation, is the need to move towards real and meaningful carbon prices. I think this is key. There are different ways to do it. Carbon tax is very simple, very efficient, and so forth. You can also have carbon market mechanism, but I think this is very important, and this needs to be embedded into the national determined contribution and LTS. We are having a lot of discussion with the countries in which we intervene. We saw before in the screen showed by Professor Nordos that Ukraine, for example, was at a very low price, quite large on the market emission system. We are trying to discuss and to work with the government so as to make the system working and efficient. As our colleague from International Energy Agency was saying, in that maybe the important thing is to start things moving, to put in place the system. Maybe the carbon price will be different, maybe the coverage will not be so large, but I think it's to get things started and to have the mechanism for monitor, reporting, verification, and then you can increase it. We saw that happening in Europe. I think we should not necessarily look for the perfect system at once, but at least start developing it, and then you can get it, with higher prices and so forth. So we are working very much to do that and supporting our countries of operation to deal with that. Of course, last point before concluding, just transition will be key. It's just transition between developed and developing economies. It's also in developing economies how to manage the changes and the shift in sectors and companies and people to adapt to the new framework.
Indeed, and thank you much indeed, Ms. Renaud-Basseau. I'm curious, by the way, I should say that the organizers have told me that there will be a chance after the comments for people to make interventions or ask questions if they would like. So if they can signal that, I believe probably it's easiest with the microphone over there. Before we turn to Minister Guzman, I'd just like to quickly ask you, as I said earlier, the European Investment Bank has said no gas investment as part of being green. That's obviously applied to inside the European Union. For a group like the EBRD, do you think you need to take a more flexible approach, given that you're dealing with developing economies as well? Are you financing gas infrastructure at the moment?
I realized I just forgot to mention that point you had in your first question. So indeed, we decided to stop every upstream investment in upstream gas and oil. So in fossil fuel upstream investment, this will not do it anymore. On midstream and downstream, we will have a slightly more pragmatic approach than the EIB, because we are intervening in countries and in areas where, for example, today 70% of the energy comes from coal. And in this, there may be a trade-off for these countries between the path of decarbonization and still relying on some fossil fuel activities. So we've had quite a tough discussion with our shareholders with very split views, and because we have our countries of operation, very dependent on coal for some, and very ambitious shareholders on the other hand, pushing for getting completely out of fossil fuels. And the approach taken is that we could still continue to make some mid and downstream investment in gas, not mainly gas. Not coal is completely out, but gas. If it's part of a very clear and credible strategy towards net zero in a given date. And we would have to show that it has a very positive impact on carbon emission, and we will not have stranded assets, and there is a very clear and ambitious strategy in the countries in which we would invest so as to move towards net zero. And in a way, this is also a way to create incentive, because the discussion we have now with some countries is, okay, we could finance this project with gas, and for example, we had this, in district heating, that could be the case, but you need a very ambitious strategy and credible and so forth. So it's a way also to to bring the countries towards committing to these long-term plans. And so I think this is a balanced way. Things will become more and more difficult. I think it's a bit of a window of opportunity now to deal with that, but in a few years, I think we will be over it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to now turn, last of all, to Minister Guzman from Argentina, which in many ways is a country that, a bit like Indonesia, epitomizes the challenge that we're talking about. I was chatting to the Minister of Finance from Mexico over dinner last night, who pointed out that 5% of the budgets of poor households in Mexico go towards gasoline. And if you suddenly jack up gasoline prices because of a carbon tax, it's going to hit the poor people very hard. I would imagine the equation is probably similar in Argentina, though I'm not sure exactly. But clearly, you have a large population of vulnerable people who would be hit by carbon tax increases. And clearly, as a country, given that you are in this process of negotiating with the IMF and others for debt rollovers and debt restructuring, you are not in a position to finance transition policies by yourself. So I'm curious, what for you do you need to go green as a country right now? Would SDRs help? Would concessionary finance help? Do you think it's reasonable to have a carbon price or carbon tax inside Argentina? And if not, how do you see Argentina actually moving on that path?
Thank you, and thank you, Ignacio and Daniele, for organizing this conference on climate. We know climate change is one of the defining aspects and problems of our time, probably one of the two largest problems that humanity faces today, the other being inequality. And they are related. They are both the consequences of how we have organized our economic systems. Gillian, your question is about asymmetries, and I'm going to focus on that when we think about how to address the issue of climate change. There are basically two tenets that Kristalina described clearly in her speech in the previous panel for addressing the issue. One is carbon prices complemented by regulatory measures, and the second is green investments. On both fronts, there are very important asymmetries among the nations of the world. On the front of carbon prices, yesterday we heard about how to deal with these asymmetries, the possibility that advanced economies go faster than developing economies. And that's certainly something that will be positive for the transition, but we will have to also take into account that there will be a learning curve when it comes to producing in clean manners. And if developing countries go slower, they will also learn slower. So this is a transition that they will have to go through anyways. So this will help, but we also have to have the elements for fostering the productive transformation that is required. So when it comes to the second tenet, the green investment, so understanding that green investment is a broad concept, we also face this issue of asymmetries. The financing conditions for developing economies and advanced economies are, of course, very different, both when it comes to public financing and private financing. And this is not just a development issue. This could also turn into balance of payments problems, because if we move ahead with carbon pricing and emerging economies, developing economies do not manage to adapt their structures of production, they will face balance of payment problems. So that's why we think this is also a matter for the IMF to look into. And going to the last point of your question, Gillian, the SDRs, what's been discussed over the last 2 days, the idea of building or creating a resilience and sustainability trust with part of the special drawing rights that are being issued, it's a very positive one, because this would help to some extent correct the financing asymmetries if this trust could be used for financing the measures that are required for the productive transformation. So let me finalize with what I started, the interrelation between inequality and climate. More advanced countries have more capacity to address climate actions, but it is possible to write rules of the global economy to improve both, understanding that there is a risk that we could go the other way. So it's very important that we work on this.
So just a couple of questions there. Firstly, to put it in a very direct way, if the IMF was to give you money in exchange for promising to go green or green faster, is that something that you would welcome? And secondly, I'd like to ask you for your views on the European Union's carbon border tax adjustment mechanism. Are you concerned that that is going to penalize developing countries?
On the second point, I may not comment now. We have to analyze the issue more. On the first point, well, certainly better financing conditions for, in our case, for the energy transformation, for exploiting the comparative advantage that Argentina has in wind energy in the south and solar energy in the north, will be certainly very helpful. And more generally, this is a broader discussion that we owe ourselves in the G20 community. There is a debt from the countries that have made the largest contribution to climate change to the other countries. And it turns out to be the case that there is a correlation between being a creditor country and an emitter of the negative externalities, and a debtor country and being damaged by those externalities. So there is much that we need to do in order to improve financing conditions, and also to discuss debt for nature swaps that will certainly help to advance these causes.
Thank you very much. We have, according to what my guidance from the organizers, about 25 minutes left. And I'd like to ask, before I ask if anyone in the floor would like to make an intervention or comment, whether either Mr. Carstens or Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati would like to comment, because I realize we've had a lot of comments floated after their initial interventions. I'm curious whether there's anything you wish to say in reaction to what you've heard.
Well, I thank you very much, Gillian. I just would like to make a comment, a very general comment. And I think in all this process, especially of carbon pricing, carbon taxing, and so on, the social and distributive aspects are very, very important, and they need to be put at the forefront necessarily. Now, this shouldn't sound as something new. I think that whenever, I mean, I had the privilege of being Minister of Finance, and whenever you put taxes, you have to think about these issues. At the same time, when you're Minister of Finance, you know that sometimes the best fiscal or tax policy is the one that is possible. And oftentimes, the possible fiscal policy is not the optimal one. So that's why I say constantly that we need to depend on many different elements to tackle this situation. There are, I mean, for example, I think one of the areas where in the last 40, 50 years, the international community has made the most advance, other than, for example, the adoption of inflation targeting, is the adoption of value-added taxes. And even though you can prove that the optimal value-added tax would tax medicines and food items, it's a generalized exception. So we need to start from the outset, incorporate those stumbling blocks, and work out how are we going to compensate one thing with the other. No, so I think this is an area where we need to work a lot, and where we need to be very imaginative to make the possible acceptable.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to quickly ask Minister Srimayani Indrawati whether you want to comment at all on what you've heard either from Argentina or the other speakers. And if not, we'll ask whether there are any interventions from the floor, or comments or questions.
Thank you. I think what just mentioned by Agustin is very important. Yesterday, when we discussed within the G20 finance minister and central bank governor, I think the discussion about resource allocation toward more green economy will definitely have a winner and loser. And so what Agustin mentioned about the easiest way is actually try to design a policy and program. The most difficult is actually to implement, because then you are going to deal with the winner and loser. First, I think for a country who has a strong social safety net, even with the strong social safety net, you are going to still face the middle class, which is going to hit relatively hard with this one, because they are not in a social safety net, but they are going to bear the burden today for the benefit of tomorrow. That's going to be the hardest politically, which need to be handled very carefully. The second one is actually in terms of the credibility of the measure that you are going to do, because this is going to change in terms of not only the signaling, but the decision of the investment. The technology definitely is going to help a lot. For example, as Laura mentioned about solar, geothermal, if the technology is going to reduce the cost significantly, then the trade-off is going to be less severe. And that will make the policy choice feasible. So in this case, the most important ingredient for all countries, especially for emerging, developing countries, to be able to participate in this climate change commitment is the access of finance and technology. Are they going to be credible? Are they going to be certain? That will be necessary condition, but not sufficient, because then you have to still dealing with the sufficient condition that is your own political constituent, which is also another very challenging task. So what I'm saying is that communication and education is very important. I'm in this case, even for me, we are using many channels of communication with social media, with cartoon, with video, with TikTok, with vlog, whatever you are using to try to say that climate change is real. So you try to reach even as the younger generation. The younger generation is actually the easiest. They are actually the one who's saying that they are care more. But then how to make this to become a political forces that allowing this change of the policy that will create winner or loser is going to be palatable. It's going to be politically acceptable, which is then the issue regarding compensation or how you are going to design the rights transition is going to be really required. And that is exactly what we really need to do. So Gillian, in this case, what I'm saying is that drafting a carbon price legislation is the easiest way. Drafting the policy is the easiest way, because you can easily just look, listen to all the experts, look at other countries, then you actually can do and copy, paste, and then design it according to your own institutional setting in each country. But really understanding who's going to be winner and who's going to be the loser and how you really deal with them. And then make an opening the political opportunity to do that is going to be very critical. Yesterday, I think France, Bruno Le Maire mentioned about yellow vest in France. That's also a real political cost, social cost for implementing a certain climate change measure. So it's not only particular for advanced country, it's also becoming even more for developing and emerging country, which is usually the social safety net is not yet quite reliable and in place. Thank you.
Well, thank you. As someone who is in the communication business, I do think that the question of communication challenges are acute. I often think the path of the financial crisis changed when somebody invented the word shadow bank to capture at a stroke the concept of what was happening outside the banking system and why it mattered. And I think that sometimes the word stranded asset has the same communication impact in trying to clarify investors' mind, but no one has yet invented a word for carbon tax which doesn't terrify voters. And whoever can invent that word for carbon tax that doesn't terrify voters will not only have more chance of getting a bipartisan deal in America, but actually managing to craft policies that work across the emerging markets too. But we have an intervention from the floor now.
Thank you very much. Sylvie Goulard from the Banque de France. I want to thank Daniele and Ignazio for this fantastic discussion. Thanks also Professor Nordhaus to put in front of us the facts and figures. I don't know why we are more afraid by taxes than being cooked, as Kristalina said. Very briefly, nobody mentioned the central banks in the way they could play a role. The Eurosystem just decided this week to go green even in monetary policy. What would be, from your point of view, and it's a global panel, so it's to all the ministers, etc., what would be the most powerful tool? Should we go for monetary policy and supervision and macroprudential? How can we help? Thank you.
Augustin, would you like to comment on that as the only central banker's bank? You are the central banker's central bank.
Yes, thank you.
And you have the luxury of not having to answer to any voters or politicians, so you can tell us what you really think.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very relevant question. We at the BIS have been analyzing this in full detail. We came with a very interesting word, the green swan concept. It's not a tax, but I think it's a good concept that has catched on. I think, I mean, you know very well, we need to work on data. We need to work on taxonomies. We need to work on understanding how the financial vulnerabilities will materialize. We need to work how to map that into regulation. We need to work each country in its own dimension on how can make compatible, for example, what the ECB decided to green their purchases of assets. I think that's a good, certainly that's a very, very good policy. And in general, I think what central banks do is that usually they have a very high intellectual capacity. And I think that the human capital in the central banks could be used towards improve just our understanding of the problem and the capacities that the financial system have. So I mean, I think there are many issues that we need to do. We need, for example, for me, finalizing Basel III would be a good way to move forward, to prepare also for all of this. So I think there are many different angles in which we need to work. And for me, all of them are important. Probably the ones who would have the most benefit is as I call to build infrastructure to work to allow the financial markets to work better towards this goal. There is where there is huge potential, and I think the return of our effort there would be immense.
Well, thank you. I'd like to ask whether Mr. President Jin would like to come in at this point at all, because of course the PBOC, President Li Gang, has been at the forefront of central bankers who have been calling for changes. And I'm curious whether working within the Asian financial system, you're seeing that the central banks in Asia do have a role in this respect as well.
Well, I think the central banks in Asia or elsewhere really have a great role to play in this regard, because the monetary policy can make a difference. I think, in my view, the ultimate solution for us to deal with the climate change is the technology. Because without new technology, it is not possible to provide renewables at affordable costs to so many people, particularly in low-income countries. And it's not possible for us to have a very smooth and quick transition to net zero. So the monetary policy have a role to play, just as fiscal policy also has a role to play. And you asked me a question about Chinese policy, but to my knowledge, China is very much ambitious because it's not simply a declaration. China has to fulfill its pledge. And given the track record of China, if China is really committed to doing something, I think China can make it. Likewise, many developing countries in Asia have the dual challenge of achieving recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and continue to control the infection of COVID-19 and also to sustain their development, particularly to deal with the high level of debt for some of these countries. So they are faced with a dual challenge. And I think the challenge is very much different from many developed countries, European countries, OECD countries. As I said, they are in the process of industrialization, and they have a lot of manufacturing sectors. The products would benefit the rest of the world. Exports from many countries in Asia, as you know, to European countries, North America, are all very much important. So I think it's very much important for the central banks of all these countries to work together and for the multilateral banks to work together. And I think it is very important for the international community to have reach consensus as soon as possible without any delay or squabbling among themselves. Thank you.
Something that everybody can agree on. We are almost out of time, and I'd quickly like to ask the other remaining panelists who have not called on if there's anything you want to react or comment on or react to in terms of what other people have said.
No, I think just one point on my side, which is the role of the central bank. I think it can be they can contribute very actively. The stress testing, analysis of the impact, the value of the assets with climate change and so forth is very important. And it's a signaling, very strong signaling effect also for private investors.
Right.
And maybe just one word on carbon adjustment mechanism. We will see what the EU will issue. What I can see is from working with countries which are in the neighborhood of the EU, and this is a very strong incentive to adjust their own domestic policies. You know, Ukraine, Turkey, they are really thinking about the impact, and you can see industrial companies in these countries calling on the government to act in order to avoid the negative impact. So I think this is also a way to create the dynamics.
Professor Barrage, do you want to add any more comments? And then I'll ask Minister Guzman whether you have anything else to add.
No, I don't have any comments to add. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Minister Guzman.
Thank you. And we're just out of time, so I will conclude by saying that by celebrating that this year we are observing a renewed multilateralism. This is very, very good news for the world. We are working on together on creating capacity for implementing the public policies that will be needed to address the biggest problems that humanity faces today. And thank you to you, Gillian, and all the panelists for the very enriching discussion.
Well, thank you. Well, I must say I found it a fascinating discussion. And if I had to sum it up, I'd say that there has been the good, the bad, and the ugly that we are currently collectively facing. The good news, the good part of the equation, is that there is now a seriousness of purpose and debate that was not around, never mind 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, around talking about these issues. I know that many people in the room have contributed to the mood changing and to putting these issues on the radar screen. And it's very, very striking how the tone has changed dramatically, even just in the last year. And the other bit of good news is that, speaking as somebody who is an observer, it does seem that people are coalescing around a number of key themes and policy planks which need to be part of any solution, such as the need for carbon pricing, which almost everybody on the panel has said needs to take place, such as a need for a lot of money to flow into renewables, such as a need for more transparency. And transparency, as a result of this simple device, the cell phone and the internet, is playing a really quite remarkable role in pushing change, such as the fact that the financial sector appears to be on board for trying to promote these changes as well. And we're going to hear more about that later on today. Certainly from the point of view of the Financial Times, I can tell you that there is an enormous story about how the financial and business world is changing, which is really quite remarkable, that I wouldn't have been predicted would have been so dominant just 3 or 4 years ago. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that speaking as someone who trained as an anthropologist and is used to looking at systems of social groups, this seems to me to be one of the biggest and nastiest political economy challenges that the world has faced. Because you're not merely dealing with extraordinarily complex trade-offs inside countries, you're dealing with trade-offs between countries. And you're dealing with all manner of political tensions, both inside countries and across borders, which made this extraordinarily difficult. What we're dealing with is a problem which cannot be solved by environmental science. It cannot be solved just by economic science or economists. Apologies to all of you in the room who are trained as economists. I'm sure that's most of you. It requires a lot of social science too, a lot of behavioral science. And bringing those three things together is going to be extraordinarily hard for all of you. And the ugly is that if we don't manage to do that, we are going to burn. We're facing a very grim future indeed, and we don't have a lot of time. The one bit of good news, though, is that if we ever needed anything that was going to act as a warm-up, a dress rehearsal for addressing these political economy challenges, it really is COVID-19, because it is a problem like climate change, which is cross-border. It's a problem which reminds us all that we are interlinked in a global chain of humanity, and if one link breaks, we all suffer. And it's a problem that illustrates very clearly, COVID-19, that you have to use a combination of hard sciences and soft sciences, that you have to think about political economies and incentives to try and get solutions. And I think that in many ways, that's a very good way to focus debate on the question of climate change and science. There is also, though, I'd say, an issue of language and communication. I would give a very big prize for anybody who dreams up a way of saying carbon tax without it sounding terrifying and making the political economy problems worse. I dare say the Banque de France would argue that taxes shouldn't be something we're scared of, but again, as someone who's a fool, I think that's something which is at the heart of so many of the political challenges today. So, as someone who is a journalist in the communications business, I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today, which is so important. I hope that we can continue to communicate it fairly and in a provocative way that forces policy change. And I commend all of you to contributing to this debate and wish you the best of luck in finding some path forward for the benefit of us all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gillian. Many thanks to all our panelists for the insightful contributions and this very interesting discussion. I am now calling on the stage Ignazio Visco, Governor of Banca d'Italia, and Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. They will discuss together the path of global climate action over the past 20 years, since the Kyoto Protocol was agreed 20 years ago.
Possiamo cambiare i bicchieri? I'm asking for the glasses to be changed. No, volevo cambiare i bicchieri soltanto, l'acqua non c'è problema, si rileva. Dia signore. Okay. Very well. Now that the glasses have been changed, we can start. Okay, it is a real pleasure, Janet, to welcome you here. Janet is the US Secretary of the Treasury, and my acquaintance with Janet dates back to about 25 years ago when she was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors after a distinguished career at Berkeley and then at the Fed. You were in the Board of Governors of the Reserve at the time, and she was chairing the Economic Policy Committee at the OECD. I happened to be at the time the chief economist of the OECD, and we had a number of exchanges and worked together. It was then the immediate aftermath of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. That was the first attempt to mitigate climate change. The original agreement committed originally 37 industrialized countries and some economies in transition, and the European Union, of course. And the commitment was to reduce greenhouse emissions by 2010, 2012, something like that, by something like 5% below what it used to be in 1990. Without that, I mean, we have seen the trend that Professor Nordhaus just showed us. Well, without that, the emissions would have increased by, if I remember, between 25 and 40%. Now, at that time, the OECD was asked to evaluate the best policies and the related costs in order to comply with the protocol. And an inspiring and leading push came from Janet. Janet was able really to somehow push the use of the OECD budget in that direction, complemented by voluntary contributions by the Nordic European countries. And so we studied the forms of carbon taxation, different regulations, incentives, and for the first time, a market mechanism to trade carbon emissions that countries unable to meet the reduction targets could buy the rights to produce additional emissions from overachievers. Now, the adoption of an emission trading system on a global scale was considered a rather useful policy response to climate change, and it required really substantial international coordination. There were a number of evaluations that we made using new modeling techniques, some general equilibrium computable calculation models were somehow giving us a cost over the next 10, 12 years of about ranging from 0.25% of annual GDP to 1% for all the Annex 1, if I remember, participant to the protocol, countries participating to the protocol. And then, however, these costs would on one side, be higher had we taken into account the rigidities in labor market, and on the other side, they could be substantially reduced if this global emission trading mechanism were in place. As Janet knows, however, the political landscape changes over time. Now we are in a favorable moment. It has been just said that the good news is that somehow we are all very much considering this to be the crucial challenge for this century, and really we have to act as quickly as possible. At the time, somehow there was mixed feelings, and with that there were important repercussions also for the OECD climate team. It had to suspend its studies, did not get any more the support it received when Janet was there and I was there. I left, you left, and somehow the lack of funding implied that most of the actions moved to the World Bank, only for some time after also the World Bank leaving their actions on climate change. Now, in 2005, the European Union, however, started an emission trading system. It is still the largest cap and trade market in the world, but it does not work because this is a global phenomenon, and you cannot have it limited to an area of the world, even as large as the European Union. Janet went back to the Fed. She became the president of the San Francisco Fed and the vice chair and then the chair of the Federal Reserve Board. I returned to the Bank of Italy. And we basically had to face oscillations in the political willingness to tackle climate change over those years. Today, I think the climate as well as the geopolitical landscapes are very different with respect to those years, and thanks to the acceleration of technological progress, and some was identified by Professor Nordhaus a few hours ago, renewable energies are now well established and fast growing. However, neither the technological change nor the Kyoto Protocol have been sufficient to arrest carbon emissions. Indeed, between 1997 and 2015, which was the year when the Paris Agreement was signed, the energy-related carbon emissions surged by more than 40% on a global scale. And they've continued to increase since then, with a temporary reduction in 2020 because of the COVID-19 and the consequence of that, but with a return to the 2019 peak this year. Now, the global responsibility for carbon emissions has also changed dramatically, because in 1997, 55% of global emissions came from OECD countries. In 2019, 2/3 of global emissions were produced by non-OECD countries. Now, these developments have made the need to act even more pressing. In the previous sessions, we have heard different ideas to achieve a global consensus on a wider international carbon pricing system, how to increase research and development in the energy sector, and clearly there's been a substantial plea on, Kristalina was very, very pushing on that, on the carbon pricing and how to really act now rather than later. Agustin also said the same, and central banks really are behind that. Now, I would like to turn you the question of what role the United States can play in leading the transition toward a low-carbon economy. And not only, however, in your official role as State Secretary, but also and especially, I would say, in this occasion, as a leading economist worldwide, and given your experience on these and other subjects. Thank you, Janet.
Well, thank you, Ignazio, and thank you to Daniele for hosting us today. How appropriate to be in Venice. Even if this weren't a conference about climate change, how could we not raise the issue here? For all of us, 2020 was the year of the pandemic, but for Venice, 2019 was also the year of the flood. As you know, the canal waters rose higher than they had in half a century, and even before that, many of the steps and statues of the old palazzos, visible when they were built centuries ago, slipped beneath the waterline. One news story I thought put it quite well. Venice is a beautiful ruler, a city that measures our world's rising sea levels and thus the increasing impact of climate change. Ignacio, you and I have been trying for a long time to measure the potential costs of climate change and advocate ways to avert them. I remember, too, first working with you after the Kyoto conference in the late 90s when you were at the OECD. We formed a high-level sustainable development group there to involve economic and finance ministries in climate policy. I remember preparing my first speech on climate change not long after the conference. This was March of 1998. The US Congress was holding hearings on the agreement, and the Clinton administration needed a White House official to testify. I raised my hand. I told Congress to think of Kyoto as a form of insurance for our planet. Wouldn't even a significant investment in transitioning our economies away from carbon be worth it if it saved priceless coastal cities like Venice, if it helped ensure we kept the world livable, and if we addressed climate change intelligently, the benefits would far outweigh the costs? In the end, we all know the outcome of that prior effort. Fast forward to today. Well, I recognize more ambitious actions need to be taken. I'm happy to report that the landscape has changed in the United States. President Biden is committed to reduce U.S. emissions from 2005 levels by at least 50% by 2030, and we're seeing a new consensus around a plan to achieve a significant portion of that reduction. It includes thousands of miles of new transmission lines for renewable energy, upgrades to our power infrastructure, and greener transportation through accelerating domestic manufacturing of zero-emissions vehicles. And with all of our domestic investments in climate, President Biden has committed that a significant share of the benefits will go to disadvantaged communities who historically have borne too much of the brunt of our country's environmental pollution. I also think the international landscape has become more favorable to making change. During Kyoto, we understood well the global challenge that climate change presented and the significant cost to the world of inaction, but we did not have the benefit of a G20 finance track then. We had fewer channels to coordinate across a broad group of countries on financial and economic challenges. By bringing together finance ministers, central bank governors, and the broader international community to discuss the economic aspects of climate change, this conference is an example of how far we have progressed in our approach over the past 20 years. I'd like to spend the balance of my remarks speaking about how the United States intends to work with our international partners on our shared responsibility to implement ambitious emissions reduction measures, because no nation can reverse climate change alone. This work begins with setting bold policy goals. We must enhance the ambition of the nationally determined contributions that we submit to the UNFCCC and set targets for achieving net zero emissions consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. As finance ministers, we must help to develop credible domestic strategies, laws, and regulations to meet these targets. The international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the multilateral development banks, can be important partners as we seek to design robust economic and financial policies to achieve our climate goals. Developing countries are particularly vulnerable to climate change, with poverty, food security, and health outcomes impacted by extreme weather shocks. In this context, the United States has redoubled our efforts around the ambitious collective goal to mobilize $100 billion per year from a wide variety of public and private sources to support developing countries in undertaking adaptation and mitigation efforts. This spring, we released America's first ever International Climate Finance Plan. As part of this plan, the United States intends to double by 2024 our annual public climate finance for developing countries and to triple our public finance for climate adaptation. That would mean about $5.7 billion per year in climate finance by 2024, including $1.5 billion for adaptation. The multilateral climate funds play a key role in this plan. The climate investment funds scale up targeted investments in clean technology and other areas, while the Green Climate Fund remains a centerpiece of providing impactful climate finance to the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. Multilateral development banks are one of the largest sources of climate finance for developing countries. The MDBs to which the United States contributes reported over $36 billion in climate finance collectively in 2020. The MDBs are also positioned well to engage the private sector in developing countries. They can target support toward the challenges in the domestic market that make it difficult for the private sector to invest at scale by advising on policies, mitigating investment risk, and providing finance. We recognize the tremendous work the MDBs are doing in partnership with developing countries. We see the MDBs continuing to evolve their role further beyond the critical development finance they provide, including to help countries design green recovery strategies in response to the COVID-19 crisis, develop green bond markets to raise capital, and build robust enabling environments to incentivize private investment needed to meet the climate challenge. We expect that they will continue their efforts to increase climate finance targets, fully align their lending with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and discourage new investments in fossil fuel-based power generation, except where other options are not possible. But we believe the MDBs can go further, and I plan to shortly convene the heads of the MDBs to articulate our expectations that the MDBs align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement and net zero goals as urgently as possible. We also expect them to take steps to more effectively mobilize private capital so that developing countries can increasingly benefit from private sector pledges to support climate-aligned and sustainable investments. As leading sources of official finance, the MDBs need to maximize the catalytic impact of their support for countries seeking to confront a changing climate and to harness the economic opportunities embedded in the transition to a low-carbon economy. I know that the MDBs have the policy expertise, the relationships, and the financial tools to make a substantial contribution toward our collective climate goals. And I look forward to working together to ensure that these goals are met. The investment needed to green the global economy is enormous, and it far exceeds the scale of official finance. Private capital will need to fill most of that gap. This brings me to our initiatives to enable the private sector to better account for climate change when making financing decisions, which we will discuss in more depth this afternoon. There are some positive trends in this regard. Investor demand for climate-aligned investments, including green bonds and sustainable assets, is rapidly increasing in certain markets. I'm also pleased to see momentum building in financial institutions around net zero commitments. A threshold challenge, though, as you know, is imperfect information, understanding the risks and opportunities climate change presents. For example, the current financial reporting system is not producing reliable disclosures. We also need consistency of reporting frameworks over time, as well as comparability across firms and jurisdictions, providing the useful information that investors need to make informed decisions. Climate change also introduces new and increasing types of risks. The risks for more frequent and severe natural disasters, the so-called physical risks, have and will continue to become more prominent. Then there are the risks that may accompany the technological market and policy changes needed to address climate change, the so-called transition risks. The emergence of these risks challenges one of the financial sector's most essential functions, ensuring that risk is borne by investors and institutions well placed to manage it. President Biden has recognized that this is a major problem that needs to be tackled now. He recently signed an executive order on climate-related financial risk, outlining a whole-of-government process to assess climate risk to the U.S. financial system and the federal government. As part of this process, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which I chair, will assess the potential risk that climate change may pose to the financial stability of the United States. The executive order also made clear this administration's policy to advance the disclosure of climate-related financial risks, which we will also explore through FSOC. This will complement the work of the SEC, which is currently reviewing existing guidance on climate-related financial disclosures. Treasury is also working closely with our domestic regulators as we engage in international discussions to promote effective and consistent approaches to disclosure. These efforts build on existing work to improve climate-related financial risk disclosure, like the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and other sustainability reporting organizations. In closing, I'm pleased that Treasury is co-chairing the newly reestablished G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which will deepen the G20's engagement over the coming years on many of the themes I raised today. The working group has an ambitious agenda for this year. In addition to developing a roadmap that will guide G20 priorities for scaling up sustainable finance, it will also focus on 3 topics. First, it will consider how to improve existing international initiatives and approaches to sustainability disclosure and reporting. Second, the working group will explore the various tools and approaches used by jurisdictions and the private sector to align finance with climate and sustainability goals and develop recommendations to enhance how they work together. And lastly, the working group will help support MDB efforts to align their financing with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So let me end where we began with Kyoto in '97. We knew back then that climate change was happening and that it was an urgent crisis that demanded our attention and action. But it's been nearly a quarter of a century since, and we have not done nearly enough. We can't afford another 25 years of inaction or low ambition. As we transition to the post-pandemic world, climate change has to be a challenge our global community addresses collaboratively. I know I'm not alone in thinking this way. This is a group committed to combating climate change. We refuse to hand this problem off to the next generation. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you to make progress on this critical issue. Thank you.
Yes, well, I think we may conclude thanking you very much for these words. There are many instruments, and all of them have to be used to meet our challenges, our targets, our objectives, the net zero emissions by 2050, 2060, more or less, we are all committed. For the time being, the instruments have incentives, regulation, subsidies, and also cutting the subsidies where they are badly placed. We have also discussed, obviously, the bad word that Gillian mentioned a few minutes ago about taxes, but perhaps this is something that in a way or another we will have to, in order for the price mechanism really to work. We started with the emission rights. I don't know whether that will ever be achievable, but in any case, there are many, many instruments that we have to put together in order to obtain our goals. Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you.